Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome. So nice to see such a full and bustling hall on this important day. Today is O-Segaki, which translates as the great assembly of making offerings to the hungry ghosts. And this is a practice that we do regularly at the temple, really on a daily basis. But then during the month of October, we take on a more intensive version of the practice. And then we have this festival on the Sunday, which is closest to Halloween. Usually this is celebrated in Japan in the summer months during the time of Obon. But it doesn't quite, the feeling of it doesn't quite fit there for us, at least here in Oregon. In North America in general, most temples have moved this festival to somewhere around Halloween, which for us is a time where the veil between this world and other worlds is a bit thinner. The practice of Segaki goes back all the way to the Buddha Shakyamuni, who lived in India some 2,500 years ago. And one of his closest disciples, whose name is Ananda, had an extraordinary experience. While there was an assembly gathered to hear the teachings of the Buddha in Kapilavastu, one of the places he often preached, after the teaching, Ananda went away from the assembly and was sitting quietly. It was at nighttime, and he was visited by this very scary fellow who we call Blazing Mouth. The Japanese name is Enku. So sometimes I'll say Enku and sometimes say Blazing Mouth. I'm kind of smirking right now because in Japanese, the gaki means hungry ghost, but also means kid. So they use that as kind of a joking way to say kid. So it's okay. So Ananda was sitting there, and then this being appeared to him, Enku, or Blazing Mouth. And he was a wild creature with hair that was, they make a big point of this in the sutra, that his hair was just all over the place, and his eyes were I think of them as spiraling. And his mouth is ablaze with flame. That's why they call him Blazing Mouth. And his neck is like pencil thin, and his belly is swollen, and he's covered with excrement and grime. And he says to Ananda, you will die in 3 days and fall into my realm of the hungry ghosts. And Ananda says, why? And Enku says, well, it is your karma. And Ananda says, isn't there something that I could do about this? And Enku, who's the king of that world, says, no. This is your karma of greed that will come back to visit you in this way. And Ananda says again, but isn't there something that could be done? And Enku says, well, there is one way, but it's impossible. He said, you would have to feed me, satiate my hunger, which itself is basically impossible. Hungry ghosts, that's why they're hungry ghosts. You can't satiate their appetite. But not just did he have to satiate Enku's hunger, but also all of the hungry ghosts in the whole realm of hungry ghosts, of which there are more than the number of grains of sand on the banks of the Ganges River. And he said, not even that is enough. After you've done that, you have to make offerings to all of the sacred beings and all of the bodhisattvas, mahasattvas, and Buddhas. And if you accomplish that kind of offering, then you could overcome this karma of your own greed. Ananda doesn't know what to do. He goes to the Buddha and he explains what has happened. And the Buddha says, don't worry, Ananda. I know a method. There is a way actually to make these kinds of offerings. And then he teaches him how to perform the Segaki ceremony. And the first Segaki ceremony is held together with the assembly on the next day. And Ananda's life is spared. That's the basic outline of the story, which we tell over and over and over again. Little details pop in here and there. But one of the things I want to draw your attention to today as we prepare for this ceremony is that there's a real circle of life that is present in this story. When Ananda goes to the Buddha and he reports what has happened, and the Buddha says, don't worry, there's a method for making this offering. He also tells Ananda, I learned this method from Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva when I was living in the heaven of complete contentment, which was where he lived before he was born into this world. He says, I learned this method from Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva, who is the Bodhisattva of compassion. So this is where the Buddha learned the method. And this is what he teaches to the assembly. Notice, the Buddha doesn't say to Ananda, I have figured out a way to destroy the realm of the hungry ghosts. I have found a way to protect you from ever being visited by a hungry ghost again. I have found a way to take care of this problem for you. What the Buddha says is there is a method to respond to these hungry ghosts. Right? And it's a method that's rooted in compassion. It's not a method that's rooted in defending yourself or beating something else. But it's a method which is based in a kind of wholeness, a wholeness that can only come from offering. I think this is really intuitively true to us, but it's easy for us to forget. The antidote to greed is not austerity. The antidote to greed is not austerity. The antidote to greed is generosity. But when we come into the problem of greed, oftentimes the only thing we can think to do is to recoil from the greed. That's austerity. Now, there's a place for austerity, right? But it doesn't actually solve the problem. The reason that we cannot fill our bellies, literally, but I would say in the world we live in now, more metaphorically, is not. It's because we don't know how to give and we don't know how to receive. And because we don't know how to make an offering of generosity and to receive an offering of generosity, the very roots of that greed can't be attended to. To just become austere doesn't take care of the greed. It's just holding you back, holding something back. So this kind of taking care of that we're doing with this practice is to recognize, of course, a hungry ghost appears. If you are practicing Buddha Dharma, or if you're even just, say, living honestly and vigorously, that might be another way to explain what it means to be practicing Buddha Dharma. You will recognize that there are some hungry ghosts that are appearing to you. And that is necessary for spiritual practice. That we recognize, not try to just not see the greed which is alive in us, but learn to be sensitive to the greed that is alive around us, through us. And if we do that, then we can see something that we won't see otherwise. And here's the real kind of good news and bad news of this practice. The Buddha doesn't also say to Ananda, we're going to take care of business once and for all, and you will never have to do this again. The Buddha says, I'm going to teach you a method, right? And we're going to enact it with the community. And this has been done many, many times before, and will need to be done many, many times again. The constant practice of responding to the appearance of the hungry ghost, that's what Buddhism is about. It's not about how do I kill Enku. It's not how do I squeeze everything out of Enku. It's like how does Enku get released? That's going to have to happen over and over and over and over again. So this circle of practice where we don't divide between greed and generosity is completely ludicrous, but necessary. If you divide out the generosity from the greed, you just end up with a practice that's turning over here and it doesn't touch anything. You have to find your own greed. Your greed is important. But then what are you going to do with that greed? You're going to practice generosity. And the reason I say that's the bad news is because that doesn't end, right? But the good news is it doesn't end, right? You have to keep doing that again and again and again and again. That the constant practice of generosity is one way we can understand what it means for there to be this full circle in which the Buddha is not rejecting anything. He's not rejecting blazing mouth. He's saying blazing mouth is part of the whole process. Pay attention, right? In fact, in many of the interpretations of this story, we understand Enku or blazing mouth to be an incarnation of Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva. And you can see this in some of the very ancient iconography where there's a picture of Enku, and up above his head is a picture of Avalokitesvara. And this is iconographically the way that you show where's that being coming from. So in that iconography, Enku himself is Avalokitesvara showing up to Ananda, knocking on the door, saying, you can't cut your greed out of this. You have to nourish it. So I'd like to invite you in this ritual this morning. After I finish talking here in a couple minutes, we'll have a few minutes of transition time into the ritual, and pieces of paper will be passed out to everyone, and we have writing instruments. And just to take a few moments to get your Ananda on, right? And just feel a little bit like, what's moving? What is this? What is some stream of greed within you, outside of you? You don't have to locate it. Just know something about it. What is that? What's the face of that stream of greed? What could you call it? It doesn't have to be overthought, but just what arises in you to write on that piece of paper. And before we start the ritual, we'll ask you to place those here on the altar. Now, the purpose of that is not, again, because we're going to banish these hungry ghosts. Our job is to nourish them, to reconnect them to the circle of being, right, which is preserved through generosity. The Gate of Sweet Nectar is the main sutra that we'll be reading together. And I just want you to listen to that name, the Gate of Sweet Nectar. First of all, sweet nectar is very nice. In this case, the sweet nectar refers to a nectar that would have been in the heavenly realms that the gods drink. It's like ambrosia, but like a liquid ambrosia. Oftentimes you'll see Avalokitesvara with a bottle, and she's doing this. She's pouring that sweet nectar down to relieve the suffering of people in this world. Okay? So the sweet nectar. But notice it's a gate. So the gate of sweet nectar, what we're enacting today is to open that gate of what is a life of sweet nectar. It's not just something that we receive because we were lucky. It's something we do. That sweet nectar is the offerings that we're making. And in the ritual practice, we do that in a very precise way that's been handed down for these 2,500 years. But the reason for doing that is to help you do that through all of your activities in day-to-day life. How do you meet your partner? How do you meet your coworkers? What would it mean to bring an offering to those places? That's the question that this kind of ritual should open up for us. Now, in the ritual itself, there'll be a couple parts, as I mentioned. In the transition, there'll be some writing on the paper, those placed on the altar. And then once the ceremony starts, it will be much like other ceremonies. If you've been here for ceremonies before, where there'll be initial offering to the Buddha Shakyamuni, prostrations, and the chanting of the Makahanya Haramita Shingyo. That's in the sutra books. If you don't have one, I think there's some more that will be passed out. And then another set of prostrations. That's all about honoring the Buddha's bodhisattvas. Right. And then a thing that only really happens in this ceremony at Buddha Eye Temple is the Ryoban. These are the people who are sitting right here in the very front. They will turn, right? And I will turn with them as well, and we'll face this direction. So now this altar here, the O-Segaki altar, becomes the altar that the ceremony is addressed to. There's a really important meaning in that. So at first we're honoring the Buddha, And then we're becoming representative of the Buddha. So the whole assembly is now the assembly that gathered together to make these offerings. So first we honor the Buddha, and then we become the assembly of the Buddha that is going to make these offerings. Notice the relationship between these two altars, just facing each other. And notice there's a mirror on the main altar. I won't say anything more about it than that, but just notice that. So then at that place there will be the heart of great perfect, the great compassionate heart Dharani. Thank you. Great compassionate heart Dharani, and that is the core Dharani of Avalokitesvara. So we intone that compassion, and then we will enter into the gate of sweet nectar chanting. And during that time, a lot of different things will happen. Unless you're a person who's doing one of those things, just relax. And I want to encourage you that during these kind of ritual, sometimes this ritual is quite long. Sometimes you find yourself kind of wandering away or feeling like it's so long. This is a lot like meditation. So just finding yourself right here and then staying present with the ritual in whatever way you can. That's sort of the point. Right? And if you do that, you'll find that the ritual has a lot more meaning than if you're trying to just pick out what's going on all the time. Right? During the Kondomon chanting, one thing I'll warn you about, for those of you who've done it before, typically we do the Dharanis in the Kondomon 3 times. This time we'll be doing them more. So you have to really listen. A number of people have practiced this, so you can follow along with it. And you really have to listen for the signal that the chant leader gives that says to go to the next Dharani. So we'll be doing most of the Dharanis 7 times, some of them 3 times, one of them 20 or 30 times. So just try to follow along with the people who know how to do it. And you can help each other out as we go along. After that finishes, then there will be the last 2 chantings that are in your book, the meaning of practice and verification. And that one is read just like a recitation rather than an intonement. And then during the last one, the Enmei Juku Kannongyo, the whole assembly will be invited to come up and make incense offerings. And that will be the end of the ceremony. I guess the last thing I would say, that particularly for parents, if you've got kids, this is quite a long ceremony, and so don't worry too much about it if they're getting squirrely. That's part of the deal. But if you start feeling a little like you need some space or they need some space, feel free to come in and out during the ritual itself. And this ritual's not one of those overly quiet type rituals, so I think it won't be much problem. Did I leave anything out for people who are here for practice or different things? Great. Okay.